So I'm going to focus on innovative financing, alternate financing, and look at one particular example. Now, I'm the director of the Center, UEL Center for Islamic Finance, Law and Communities. But contrary to impressions that might be generated by just the title, we are a multi-faith, interdisciplinary research-led organization that really looks at the diversity of funding sources, but also not just for prosperity, but also for empowerment and social justice. So let me start by just recapping what has already been pointed out. I think Virginia put this slide up to say that what we have in the Sustainable Development Goals is not merely one of the most ambitious agendas for development, but also one of the most expensive. So what we have, therefore, is a world where there are multiple challenges as far as disaster, as far as conflict, climate change, and so on and so forth. I mean, we had a look at Senda, and if you focus closely on each one of the priority areas, you'll see that investment is either implicit or actually quite obvious. And the fundamental questions that all of us confront with happens to be, how can we actually generate the resources, local, national, and at the international level, to meet the demands that exist? So you can see in all of this, whether it's at the local level or the partnership level, one of the important elements is funding these activities, which all of you are quite familiar with. I'm just going to pick up on one of the reports that I think most of you would actually be familiar with. This is a report, in fact, 2013, but it actually gives us some stirring facts, which I'll come to in just a moment. So if you look at, sorry, this might appear to be a bit blurred, but I just wanted to point out that where the money comes from, where it is spent, and what kinds of activities and what kind of disasters is quite a rich data for us to examine how we could do better. But I think the point that emerges is that if you look at not just Japan, but the kind of sources that we have, they're quite limited, and we are missing both certain groups of countries as well as certain sources. Then much of the emphasis is on particular type of financing. This actually is again brought out by, I would say, a rather limited number of countries who are contributing. I must add the caveat, of course, over here, that when you're talking about financing at some sort of public level or at the international level, we're of course only talking about part of the story. Much of the resources, as I think many of you have pointed out, are generated local level and through the community level. We talked about self-help, we talked about resilience, and all resourcing is actually a part of it. But I'm moving on to a bigger question over here, and that happens to be that there is a major crisis in terms of funding for development. And I think successive conferences have actually been talking about this. So Haiti has been hit again. And certainly the first impressions that we have is not merely a crisis of what's happening on the ground, but a crisis within the global community. Call it fatigue, call it apathy. It's not just a question of political will, it's a question of resources. So which is why when you're talking about financing for development, we are talking about the need to diversify these forms of funding. So how do we go about it? Now, I'm going to take one example of what I would consider to be an interesting way that things are developing. I'm looking at the Muslim world, which is probably an interesting way to put it, but faith-based communities are quite diverse. So I think even when you talk about Islamic or Muslim or Christian or otherwise, they're quite diverse. But the resilience and resistance comes in over here through faith-based communities, and responses in many ways are through the communities, but also at the global level. So there are Christian, Jewish, Hindu, and other relief organizations. But you'll also notice that if you're talking, for example, about Aceh, where Muhammadiyah, which was an Indonesian 30 million member reformist group that was leading the operations, or you look at Islamic Relief Agency, whether it be Kandahar or in Pakistan or Bangladesh. These are interesting examples. And what I want to concentrate upon here is not merely the activism on the ground, but the innovative ways in which, in many of these countries, whether you're talking about Iran or whether you're talking about other countries, they have used alternate forms of funding to bring in the public to invest and use. And here I'm not talking about invest in merely in terms of recovery and restoration. I'm talking about even prevention, and meeting the challenges at that point of time. So let me here start off by posing to you quite interesting statistics. So the gap in development funding, I mean mapping both Sendai but also SDGs, is estimated to go into tens of trillions of dollars. At the same time, if you look at Islamic finance, it is one of the emerging portfolios which is expected to hit about 3 trillion at any point of time. Now this is something which is kept completely outside the sort of formal global agenda, but with huge potential, not only in the size of the potential resource flow, but in the manner in which it can be used. And when I use ethical finance in many countries, and our center has done some work across the world, for example, working with FCO in training in Indonesia or training in Iran or in Saudi Arabia. In all these places, it's not so much the Islamic component of it, but the products that are considered to be ethical, responsive in terms of participative, or you can call it green finance or alternate financing. So I just want to take a few minutes to look at this a little more closely. And interestingly, some of the conversation we had, for example, working with UN Habitat in my earlier birth, we talk about a continuum of financial rights. So of course we are right to focus on conventional financing as it exists, but you could actually draw a continuum where you could talk about green, cooperative, responsible, ethical finance. And what is interesting is that when we speak about SDGs and financing, we're able to also generate within the theologies and others both tools as well as justifications which provide the kind of sustainability, inclusion and stability that exists. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to try to expand on this. But the limited point I'm making here happens to be, it's not very difficult to actually muster up the support or the rationale for prioritization on disaster risk reduction activities, because if we look closely at what is called the maqasid al-sharia, which Muslims believe to be the objectives of the law, it clearly turns out to be many of the priorities within, let's say, Sendai framework or the SDGs itself. Now, why is Islamic finance considered to be ethical? Apologies to those of you who already have an advanced knowledge, but very quickly, we are talking here about a system based on risk sharing, not risk sharing of both profit and loss. The ethical concepts on how money can be used, that money cannot make money, and also we talk about prohibition of riba, which is interest, and there are so many other issues involved over there. So I am merely going to run across and say that this represents opportunities for the disaster risk reduction community to use the funds that are out there. Because Islamic finance is not merely a social finance or infrastructure finance or public finance, but it proposes and offers a range of instruments and targets which are in the public as well as in the private field. So how does this actually work? So the Islamic financial tools that exist are both debt-based as well as equity-based. And they're based on a whole range of instruments that are there. And I will not go into this in any particular detail, but just to say that in conflict-ridden countries, some of which I've had the privilege of working in, whether it be Afghanistan, Iran, Indonesia, and more recently in Somalia, either in terms of drafting laws or setting up financial systems, or at least supporting them, you see that in times of crisis, whether you're talking about conflict or disaster, faith emerges where it is part of both authenticity and confidence building. And we have noticed that whether you talk about community-based approaches or faith-based approaches, they tend to have a resurgence of sorts. I work with an organization called the Global Land Tool Network, which we set up about 10 years ago. And we have what is called the Islamic mechanism. The Islamic mechanism simply means that when you are engaging in countries where there are a large percentage of Muslims, you need to consider whether Islamic approaches, financial, legal, or otherwise, not merely the formal but the bottom-up approach, can be used beneficially. To what extent? Where it's appropriate. And this has really worked because the main point about sustainability happens to be authenticity and ownership. And Islamic finance has actually worked both at a sort of a broader investment level, but also community-based approaches. So I'm going to give you quick examples. It's been used in education, it's been used in health, used by the World Bank and IDP. Sukuk refers to Islamic bonds for reconstruction, recovery, refugee relief, energy, and socially responsible investments, and so on. So with Jimmy's finger rightly going up, I'd like to just point out two quick points. That we have an opportunity over here to look at some good examples where ethical finance or responsible finance has been used. And to scale up, we need to do that through documentation, through piloting, replication, rollout, something which our center is setting out to do. And the point is, the vaccine sukuk that I mentioned a little while ago shows that investors are not looking for maximization of returns all times. When they're convinced that they are investing in a good cause, something that leads to stability, harmonization, and recovery, they're able to take what is called reasonable and competitive rate of returns. So again, I would like to hark back to a point that has been made by many speakers, that this is all about multi-stakeholder models that will work. I'll end up in pointing out to just one slide, which I couldn't focus on because of lack of time, and that happens to be SDG 5, which is about gender-based financing. We do a lot of work on this. In fact, it's one of the primary approaches of the center. And you can see that we need to invest again in gender priority areas. But this is not considered to be a male-dominated industry, which is investing in women as it chooses, but participative. So financial inclusion is very important, and we are looking at how we can spearhead that with ethical finance, governance issues, recognizing the diversity of women and context. And I must end up in saying that much of what we've been thinking about is very true to the theme of today's conference, which is youth leadership. And we are trying to focus and find out how these additional supplementary flows of funding for disaster risk reduction can be used to generate youth-led approaches, whether it be employment, but more important, the choices that youth must make for the sustainability.